The first time I went to Manhattan, I must have been about 27. I wasn't exactly keeping a diary or much of a schedule back then. The national newspaper I worked for had another massive round of layoffs. Come to think of it, I believe they used the British word redundancy, which sort of sounds worse now that I think about it. Redundant, no longer required. To be clear, I was still required to write, but not to be in the office or on the full-time payroll. The day it happened, we were all asked to remain at our desks until the phone rang. I sat there for ages, and then the phone rang. I threw the contents of my desk into my bag, got up, walked to the managing editor's office with a lump in my throat, clutching my security pass, and emerged about 5 minutes later with a large-ish check, but no security pass, and had to leave the building. I was so freaked out because I had no idea what to do with the rest of my life. I remember I was too scared to get on the underground, the subway, in case I got mugged or lost the check, so I took an expensive black cab home. It cost me £13. I still remember the amount. A few weeks later, I was at Heathrow, boarding a plane to Manhattan. Why? Because when you've spent a lifetime, or up to the age of 27, watching movies about Manhattan, it's where you probably go when someone finally gives you a largest check. A friend from university said I could crash on her couch for the week. She lived in a railroad apartment on the lower part of the Upper East Side. From the front door, tons of locks and chains, you could see straight through from the main room to the bedroom at the back. She warned me about the cockroaches that would scatter across the kitchen when the lights went on in the morning, and I acted nonchalant, but they terrified me. The first morning I woke up to the shrill sirens, garbage trucks, and an overwhelmingly caffeinated atmosphere. It was amazing. I was there. We made a pot of chock full of nuts coffee, and I ate my first bagel ever. I loved it. I recognized streets and landmarks from every movie I'd ever seen set in the city. Spent the next week rushing around, walking miles uptown, downtown, across town, through the park, into every gallery at the Met, and then stopping to refuel at every cool coffee shop down Lexington and into Soho. I quoted lines from films in the locations where they'd been shot and tried to pretend I was a resident and not a tourist. I even ate at Kat's Deli on the corner of Ludlow and Houston, but found out they don't serve breakfast at Tiffany's. I got Chinese takeout and we ate out of the cartons, again, just like in the movies, while watching TV. I was introduced in real life to actors and writers. I learned to order like a New Yorker, grilled cheese on wheat and a cup of coffee regular, and sit at the counter, always at the counter. I hung out in bookshops and combed through the vintage clothing rails in the village looking for bargains. I splurged on something, a big meal long forgotten, at the Russian Tea Room near Carnegie Hall, and of course I sat in the same booth that they used in Tootsie. Over the next few years I went back to New York about 10 times. It was the height of Silicon Alley until it became the depths of the dot-com bust, and everyone I knew got pink-slipped and fired. Those were heady days, though. I had transitioned from being a journalist to a digital consultant, and I had a British accent, which helped. I'd read the right books and the computer networking journals, and I could talk up a good game. No longer crashing on couches by this point, I was steadily working my way up the hotel brand power list, from Hotel Elysee, 60 East 54th, to the Peninsula. Very fancy. When in a relationship, I was even taken as a guest to the Essex house overlooking Central Park, no less. When there was a we took trips to stay with friends who had houses in East Hampton, a very coupley thing to do, and we rented apartments in New York on business, and this was pre-Airbnb. Meanwhile, I'd finally got a job and a work visa to the USA, but that life was waiting for me on the other coast, not Manhattan. I emigrated to Los Angeles on August the 16th, 2001. I loved Los Angeles, but I couldn't get sponsored for a green card. Life on work visa after work visa was very stressful, and at some point I knew it would have to end, but I didn't want to go back to England. I worked on some really glamorous things in Los Angeles, like The Devil Wears Prada, a story for another time, but nothing was consistent, and there were scary periods chasing jobs while avoiding immigration. "You need to get yourself a real job in New York," said friends who knew the deal. How hard could that be? I replied, wondering exactly how hard that could be. But undaunted, I pitched job concepts, plunged into interviewing, went back on friends' couches while on hurried trips, struggling through bicoastal jet lag, and eventually I made it. I got a job in New York. I was in the big leagues. Another friend, you'll sense a theme here, I'm nothing without my network, said I could sublet a sublet, which is classic New York real estate tale, in Chelsea. I sold or gave away almost everything I'd acquired, which wasn't much. I put on my new posh I work in Manhattan wardrobe into a suitor and case and posted my vintage books via media mail from the USPS in Malibu. The apartment in New York was an EBW, exposed brick wall, 19th century with distinctly late 80s decor. It was perfect. I had a week or so, or before I was due at the new job, so I explored the city as a resident at last. Then, on the first morning of the new job, I slipped into my crisp Brooks Brothers, yes really, navy trousers, white t-shirt, navy slim-fit cardi, and highly polished brogues, instantly wilting in the heat as I caught the subway from 18th Street. But life got exciting very quickly, and I identified as a New Yorker from my first yelling at a car on a crosswalk moment. The job went well. I even had a Jennifer Aniston moment from the movie Picture Perfect, 1997. Do you know it? The bit where she walks through Times Square and says, "I want that," meaning the giant advertising campaign. Well, one of my projects ended up on a digital billboard down at Penn Station. I went down there and I just watched the carousel go round and round and did an inner squeal when I saw my work flash past. My life was going well. I made lots of cool new friends and decided it was time to move from the sublet of a sublet in Chelsea, and I found a large studio on what the real estate agents called the UWS, Upper West Side, but was really kind of midtown but by the river behind the Lincoln Center. 101 West End Avenue had once been the printing plant for the New York Times, exactly why I, as a former journalist, took the place, of course. The newsprint had come down via boat from Canada down the Hudson, where the rail yards used to be. Unfortunately, while I lived there, the rail yards were all under redevelopment into several luxury all-glass skyscrapers. So for my entire 3 years, the horrifying din of construction continued apace. But it was a great vantage point to reach, well, everywhere. And even though there wasn't a nearby subway, there was a posh van laid on for all the media, entertainment, and tech workers who lived at 101, dropping us off at the Time Warner Center and the Hearst before heading downtown. Downtown is where I moved next, to Soho. Such a great part of town to live in, even when the power went out for over a week during Superstorm Sandy. I lived at the corner of Prince and 6th at 202 Avenue of the Americas, which is an address no Yorker will ever call it because everyone calls it 6th Avenue. The building dates from 1910, it's still there, and originally was a walk-up. You could tell because the elevator, when it worked, was one of those tiny ones fitted into what was probably an air shaft or something. I lived on the 5th floor, not quite the top. I prefer to live at the top of buildings, as I love a good view, and I really hate having upstairs neighbors, especially when I was doing long-haul travel and couldn't sleep. I later wrote my book, How to Stay Sane in a Crazy World, in that apartment. If you ever get hold of a copy, you'll see I took all the photos, and some of those photos were taken in apartment 5E. But I digress. 3 years on, a few awards won, some recognition, speaking at conferences and being quoted in the press, and I got moved upstairs to the International Division, and an amazing view from the 42nd floor. A lot of things about my life at that point reminded me of a Nora Ephron movie, including seeing Nora Ephron herself do a talk at the 92Y in 2010. Life had become mostly fabulous on the 42nd floor office. My job required, if such a job is appropriate to use, travel, lots of it, at the front of the plane no less, turning left. During that period of my life, I went to China, Korea, India, Taiwan, Hong Kong, France, Amsterdam, Italy, and back again, several times. It was amazing, until it wasn't. After 7 years in New York, I was burnt out. And I was heartbroken. I wasn't sure what to do next, so I moved back to Los Angeles because I'd been there before and I felt safe there. And I've been back here in LA for 10 years, which I find extraordinary, as it still only feels like yesterday I left the other coast. However, in 2019, I bought a last-minute plane ticket, deciding I just had to be in New York during Christmas again. I stayed in the Life Hotel in Nomad, an area I don't believe existed under that name when I lived there. The hotel, the Life Hotel, is in an 1890s era building where they used to produce Life magazine before Henry Luce took it over. It felt wonderful being back, especially inside such a historical place. I got pretty nostalgic with the mad clanging of the heating pipe started up and the cold air blasted my face whenever I walked outside, making me pull out my faux fur-lined parka closely around my body. As I walked around the city, I took in all the sights, almost not as someone who'd lived there before, but with a fresh perspective. It was a wonderful trip. As you might have guessed when I said Christmas 2019, that was a difficult time. The plane ride home was very scary. People were coughing and several seemed very ill indeed when we disembarked at LAX. I don't remember getting home. Perhaps I took a shared lift or maybe mass transit if it was a daytime landing. Anyway, within a few weeks we all learned about COVID-19 and I've not been back to an airport since. It just hasn't seemed necessary to travel, although many of my friends have been going back and forth to Europe or elsewhere in the past 3 years. But I digress. What I miss most about Manhattan is the energy. It's frenetic and constant and exhilarating. There's an all-pervading feeling in New York that anything at all might happen at any minute. I love that. Even though I equally love the serenity of Southern California, but I miss New York, I really do. I'm not sure I could ever live there again, but there's a possibility of working somewhere else coming up in 2023, with maybe extended periods in an office in Manhattan. I don't know whether that's the plan or if there's something else I'll be doing next year, but every time I think about walking down Madison Avenue, crossing over to Park, heading into Grand Central Station, I just get this sparkly, twinkly sensation in my head, which is just delicious.